Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. This is our Renew's 7th extension session that forms part of Renew's Sustainable House Day program for 2024. My name is Helen Oakey. I am the CEO here at Renew, and tonight I'm really pleased to be hosting Out of the Box, where we will be discussing the significant strides that prefab and modular building sector is making in Australia, amongst other aspects of off-site construction industry. We've got people tuned in from all over the country tonight, from a wide variety of unceded lands. I'm speaking from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri Willam people in the northeast of Melbourne, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners that have nurtured country since time immemorial through their spiritual and material connections to the lands and the waters. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend this respect to all First Nations people the world over. Here at Renew, we're very grateful for the support of our sponsors, and in particular, those that make Sustainable House Day and this extension series possible. We'd like to thank all of our sponsors, and tonight a special call out to Bank Australia for supporting this extension session. I'd like to encourage you also to support Renew, and there are many ways that you can do this. One of the most fundamental ways is to become a member of Renew. We are a community-based, membership-driven organisation, and you can find out how to become a member on our website. Or you might like to subscribe to one of our two excellent publications, Renew Magazine and Sanctuary Magazine, both of which are absolutely gorgeous to look at. We've got them right here. Oh, not focusing. And I'd highly encourage you to have a look and sign up to those. There will be a link put in the chat, so if you'd like to click on the link and go through and have a look, that's a good way to get into those. So tonight we're going to be diving into the prefab and modular building sector, using the expertise of our wonderful panellists to dig into the fundamentals and the latest developments. So looking at the advantages and possibly disadvantages of these types of builds and how they stack up against the more traditional methods in both a home to live and the cost to build. So are they comfortable? Are they energy efficient? And are they efficient to build? Is this perhaps the way of the future? Before we go any further, I'm going to introduce a whole host of people. So for those of you who haven't met me, I'm the new CEO at Renew. I have worked in sustainability, climate advocacy, and community engagement for over 2 decades. As the Executive Director of the ACT's organisation, I led work on fossil gas and transport emissions, biodiversity, and planning. I've instigated community engagement programs to help get Canberrans off gas, something that's also very close to our hearts at Renew, and to better utilise active travel. I have a background in campaigning and public policy, and which was grounded in roles as parliamentary advisor and leading Greenpeace's advocacy team. So this is our 7th session in the series of 8 that's designed to give you a deeper understanding of sustainable design principles, whether you're embarking on your own build, a renovation retrofit, or looking for your next rental home. There's one more session to go, which is on Thursday night this week, which is called Enoughness, Building Small and Clever, and it will be hosted by our very own Nathan Scalaro, who is the editor of Renew Magazine. You'd be crazy to miss that one. It's the very last one in the series, and it really challenges that notion that we don't have to have big houses to have safe, warm, comfortable, energy-efficient homes. So the link to the next session, the last session, the 8th in the series, will also be put in the chat. And so if you haven't already signed up for that one, I'd encourage you to do so. There's some beautiful ways of living in smaller homes that I think probably inspire all of us. So tonight, I'd like to get on to welcoming our speakers and experts. First up, I'd like to welcome Josh Chaplin. With over 20 years in modular construction, Josh brings a high-level expertise to the Modscape team. Modscape, established in 2006, are leading Australian experts in off-site construction. Josh oversees all aspects of the pre-construction process, spanning both commercial and residential sectors, including procurement, project management and consultation, and sales management. He's passionate about the evolution and the growth of the modular space, both locally and internationally. This is the first time Josh has joined us at Renew, and we're really pleased to have him here. I had a very interesting warm-up chat with him the other day. So thanks, Josh, for being part of our Renew community tonight. We really appreciate your time. I'd also like to welcome Sophie McRae. Sophia works for the Commercial Building Policy section within the Energy Division at DECU, which is the Federal Department, Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. I got that right. Sophie is not here with her work hat on tonight, but she does bring that expertise and experience with her. So that will make her a useful person to have in the room as we discuss some of the policy issues around this conversation. Sophia also holds a Master's in Sustainability and Planning. In search of their own sustainable home, budgetary restraints led Sophia on a slightly unconventional path, that of redesigning a prefabricated home to sustainability standards. For 3 years now, Sophia and her family have been happily ensconced in their all-electric 7.7 NatEarth star-rated home. Welcome, Sophia, and I'm not sure how many panels you've been on in the past for us, but we're very, very pleased to have you back, and we know that you've been a long friend of Renew as well.
I love being involved, and it's a delight to be back again.
And last but by no means least, please welcome David Ritter. David also brings to the forum the invaluable homeowner perspective, as well as a career embedding sustainability and resilience principles into core concepts for our cities and our communities. He is Grimshaw Global's sustainability lead for the ANZ region. That's ANZ, Australia, New Zealand, not the bank. And with 25 years of experience, he has a deep and holistic understanding of interconnected sustainability drivers and green technologies. He's the owner of Prefab Perfection, which is a Victorian cottage with high-performing prefabricated extension. His home was featured in Sanctuary 64, which is actually the edition I just held up a minute ago. So if you haven't read up about it, that's a good place to go and check it out. David, this is your first time to a Renew forum, and many thanks for being here tonight.
Good evening, and thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's dig in. And obviously tonight we'll also have lots of questions from the floor, but I'm going to kick off with a few questions, get the conversation started. And just wanted to acknowledge that in the background we have our wonderful Renew technician Dave, and also the wonderful Cara, who is going to be facilitating taking questions from the floor and feeding those through to us if we haven't got round to them. And you might also find sometimes that some of the panelists might step in and answer some of your questions as we go. Okay, so Josh, I'd like to kick off with you. You've been working in the off-site construction space for over 2 decades. Can you give us an overview of this marketplace and where you think it's heading?
Yeah, I guess thinking when I started, it was just after the Olympics in 2000, and there was quite a bit of accommodation, going out for the Olympics, obviously for the athletes and other people running the games. And since then, I've started in probably more of the commercial space and seeing the industry evolve from the simple sort of site shed through the businesses I was with into a lot more permanent sort of prefabricated projects like schools, hospitals, hotels, and obviously with Modscape now, some nice high-end housing, as well as moving into the affordable and social housing space as well. So quite an evolution over those 20 years. Completely different from where I started to what it is now.
So Australia seems to have been a little bit slow on the uptake in terms of using prefabricated options for the housing market sort of widely. How does Australia stack up against other countries that are doing this, particularly in Europe, where they seem to really embrace this industry far more and are more accommodating and advanced? And what do you think needs to happen in Australia to get that going, more fully in the Australian marketplace?
Yeah, good question. We think we're in the prefabricated modular space. We're around 5% of the construction industry in Australia. Overseas in the US, Europe, Asia, it's about 30%, so a much bigger chunk of that sector. And in some areas like Sweden, it's up to 80%, which is a lot to do to climate, but then it's also just efficiency of building over there as well. So majority of the people in our space believe that we're on a big growth trajectory, and we think that over the next 5 years our sector is going to triple, and then in 10 years catch up to the rest of the world. So yeah, there is a lot of growth happening. There's a lot of growth happening every year since I've been in the game. So yes, we are getting closer, and it is becoming more of the norm. And probably especially like Melbourne, for example, Victoria always has seemed to be sort of the most accepting state that I've seen of prefabricated and modular solutions, but it's definitely growing.
So Josh, we talked the other day, and I'm just was hoping that you might be able to do that revisit of what exactly are we talking about here? What is it that people need to be accepting of? And what is it that exactly sort of happens in this prefab modular sort of space? If you're somebody that's actually in that construction space, what does that look like? And what do you end up with, being delivered to your block of land? Just a quick overview of that.
Yeah, so it's probably just getting away from the old thinking of the old site shed, the old demountable. That's there is still a bit of that around, and there's still a need for that around, but there are a lot of companies that have moved past that and are building very high quality homes, and they to try and address some of this home shortage. So that's, I guess, just getting that stigma away from the old rickety site shed or the old demountable that many of us learnt in. That it's come a long way since then, and I guess with a bit of education from different industry sectors like Prefab Oz, for example, that are trying to educate the market that it is a very another good alternative to use compared to conventional construction. And then you ask what do you get? So what we do at Modscape, we've sort of got two parts. One is like a full 3D volumetric module that is built as a home in the factory, and the plan is to get it to 95% completed in the factory. So then there's very little work to do on site. So for homes generally delivered and installed to site in a single day, then within a couple of weeks you've completely finished your connections and landscaping, and you're moving in. So it can be a very, very fast process. And then another part of what we're doing and starting to grow more into is a kit of parts or panelized solution where we can offer wall panels or ceiling panels to other home developers that are still conventionally building as the majority of their work, but looking to prefabricate some of their components to try and speed up and de-risk what they're doing on site.
So just what do you think would be the top 3 benefits for a consumer in terms of engaging in this prefab space? What are the top line messages that you tell people? Why do it this way?
Speed's normally number one. It's generally 50% quicker than building conventionally. The second one is probably certainty. There's been a lot of builders sort of going under recently, and the exposure when you're building prefabricated or whether it's modular or panelized, it's generally a very short process. So you're not open to that 12-month contract or 18-month contract where you're building. So you're open to all those different fluctuations with labor and materials. It could be as little as a 3-month, 4-month process. So that certainty is huge. So they're the top 2, as well as there's a handful of others. But what we're talking about here is sustainability and material wastage. So we do a lot of work with trying to make them as green as we can, as well as really trying to minimise what goes to landfill.
So, Sophia, this kind of feeds into your story a little bit about what drew you to doing a prefab. Can you tell us a bit about your story and how you wound up with a prefab home and what the benefits were from your perspective?
Yes, and it follows on from what Josh was saying. Well, when you're asking Josh, what can we say to the market to make it attractive? And I'm here to say I am part of that market as a homeowner, as a first homeowner, and as a low-income person. It was I just started as a town planner at that point as a second career, and so I initially I was doing a lot of research by reading Sanctuary cover to cover and reading Renew and getting involved with people like Jenny Edwards and Tim Forsey and Richard Keach, who started up the My Efficient Electric Home Facebook group. So I was studying to find out the best way to build my home and to get the highest outcome. So initially I was interested in structural insulated panels, which are a form of modular building in that they're prefabricated, and that was something that I thought was going to be good. It ended up being out of my price range, and so as a town planner I was actually had the opportunity to get lots of designs coming across my desk, and I realized that the prefabricated designs that were coming through needing planning approval were going to be perfect for me, and they were going to be much more affordable as well. It became a very easy pathway after the frustrations of trying to work with structural insulated panels, which are quite an unfamiliar material. Builders just weren't really very comfortable with it, whereas with a prefabricated house, it was a business where they have a really good system set up. They're able to control it very well because it's all done on their factory yard, and that meant that they could do it very efficiently, and they were very happy to upspec the design of the building, because again, it was something that they were able to control completely on site. And so I was able to get those up specs done. I knew that there's going to be attention to detail because it's all done on the same premises with the same team of people. So there's that good relationship on the site. I knew that there wasn't going to be wastage. I knew that there was very unlikely to be delays. I signed my building contract at the end of 2019, and we all know what happened a couple of months after that. But even with the pandemic restrictions coming in, I had the keys to my house by July in 2020. So it was a smooth process, even considering that we'd just gone into the pandemic conditions at that point. And I felt really confident about the product I was getting because I was able to go up and visit the factory site. And then when the house was delivered, it came in on the back of 2 trucks and it was craned into place. And I could actually see that, I could see how the construction had been done. And then I was able to do a blower door test and able to sort of hold them to account in terms of how much detail had been paid to doing the building envelope really well, getting the insulation in really well. So all in all, it was a really satisfactory experience.
So, what were the key sustainability benefits that you were looking for? What boxes did it tick in that regard, in terms of the way it was put together? And because obviously you're quite conscious of your sustainability and your footprint. So yeah.
So I wanted to get somewhere in the high 7s in terms of the NatHERS rating. And I knew that the first way to do that is to get the orientation right. And that was quite an easy thing to do when you've got when you're starting with a vacant block of land. That is the most simple thing to do, is to get your orientation right. It's a wonderful opportunity for anyone who's building new, which is a lot harder when you're retrofitting. So I was able to do that right from the start. And then the next thing was making sure that the insulation was going to be very high spec, that I could get the double glazing in right from the start. Again, that's a harder thing to do if you're retrofitting, and in fact, shouldn't be a priority if you're retrofitting, but when you're building from new, you can do that. It's very cost effective to get all the double glazing in, make sure that you've designed the sides of the windows appropriately for the house, make sure that the eaves are designed correctly. So they're all quite simple design measures to learn about with a little bit of reading. And it is quite easy for anyone to learn that these are the kind of measures you can add on to the design of your house in that, while it's all on paper, to make it function really well. And then it was a question of just making sure that there was going to be attention to detail in making the building envelope really tight. And that was simply a case of the director of the business knowing that me as a client cared about this. I wanted a good result. I was going to be testing it with a blower door test. And so that simply meant just making sure that the workers on site who are familiar with the way that the houses are built, there's a good relationship there, because it's not just subcontractors and different teams going all over the place. So they were able to say, okay, we're going to make sure that, you know, the client really wants everything put in properly. We've got a process for doing this. We're just going to really pay attention to it. And it came up with a really good result. And of course I made it all electric.
Of course you did. and I guess the interesting thing there is that the people that were doing the construction for you, they weren't particularly focused on sustainability when they started working with you. It was something that you drew them to, but you didn't really hit a lot of resistance along that pathway, whereas sometimes we can hit quite a lot of resistance when we're doing, you know, other types of building jobs.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate. I think it may be because it wasn't a really large business. It was a large enough business that it had efficiencies of scale, in that it had enough product going through its yard that it had an efficient process, but it was small enough that it cared about every client it had. And so I was a client who had value to them, rather than, I imagine, very large businesses see the clients just as, we need to make some money and we're churning out a product, whereas it was a bit different in this case. And I think the nature of the businesses who are doing prefab dwellings, where they're not just sort of, you know, like they're not interested in the mass-produced end of it. They actually do want to create good quality dwellings for clients. And I imagine that they're the kind of business that really wants to pay attention to what the client wants and try and work to achieve something that is good value and performs really well.
I'm just going to go to David now. David, you did use prefab on the extension of a heritage cottage in the inner city of Melbourne. Can you talk us through what got you to that decision to do that? It seems like a slightly incongruous kind of match, but obviously it's worked for you really well. And how's it stacking up in regards to sustainability?
Yeah, so yeah, I suppose my background is I trained as an architect. I've been working in sustainability consulting and design through my career. So I guess I was a little bit gullible in you know, coming along to those doer upper. There's lots of potential for this one. So the house that we ended up putting a bid on was a sort of unloved corner in Richmond. It's next to a laneway, so it runs down the back of some commercial premises here. It's a very tight site, so it's sort of 25 meters by 5 meters. And I was very ambitious around sustainability, in the sense that I wanted to achieve passive house standards. So trying to achieve, I suppose, the best you can with building fabric to drive down sort of thermal energy demand and drive up human comfort and delight in the interior. And also, it's quite a noisy site, right? So being able to have a building that performs very well from an airtime perspective is not all about the thermal performance. It's about an acoustic performance as well. So going down that road, I wanted to really try and achieve quality for the build. And so I was looking at all kinds of construction methodologies, but I think the way we ended up going was we had a sketch design carried out initially by an architect, just really mapping out the form that fitted in with the planning envelope, if you like, the maximum envelope for the site. And that was a really lovely sketch, which sort of pulled the addition to the existing building a little bit away and had a little courtyard in the middle. So it was a kind of enjoyable interior space. But it was essentially, you know, a little piece of a heritage Victorian building with a sort of connection breezeway, if you like, and then an addition on the back, which is 2-story. So we had a sketch design, and I felt that I really wanted to try and achieve a quality product, particularly around the passive house performance, air tightness, thermal quality. And it made sense to me to talk to design and construct, or sort of prefabricated design and construct companies. So I ended up talking to Arkit, and we looked at different options, and the most suitable option for the site was what Josh referred to earlier as a sort of more kitted parts approach, a panelized approach. So there was just enough access in the laneway to bring in prefabricated panels, essentially. So pieces of wall, essentially. It's still kind of traditional stick build, really, but just prefabricated in the factory as panels, and then you can kind of construct them and kind of clip them together on site, and it's quite a fast process. So I think the advantage for us was that, you know, we didn't want to be out of our home for too long, so it was faster on site. It gave good quality construction, particularly around meeting passive house performance. It also, I think, gave us a bit more cost management certainty as well. I think something that Josh alluded to earlier is that I think with prefabrication, there's a little bit less kind of bumpiness in the supply chains, right? So you're able to work with a design and construct prefabricator and have more kind of iterative conversations around cost and have a bit more certainty around cost. So I think that was important to us as well. And I think generally it worked out really well for us. I think actually we were kind of lucky in that I think we signed our contract at the end of 2020, but we managed to dodge the big price rises during COVID because I think essentially a lot of the materials were pre-ordered. And so when they were kind of going up in price, I can't remember the date, 2021, I guess it was. Yeah, we were insulated from that. And also the works were able to carry on in the factory, you know, because it was allowed for them to work in a factory as opposed to the restrictions that were on site as well. So there were some other kind of unforeseen benefits of going down that road.
Thanks, David. Sophia, I'm just going to go back to you. Can you just, I guess one of the things that's sort of coming up in the questions, and maybe you can speak to your experience, but also Josh can speak to this, is exactly what turned up in your house when it was delivered on site, and what did you have to put in once it was delivered? So how much is done and how much needs to be done later? Obviously, any modules need to be connected. But apart from that, how did it look when it arrived?
Oh, it looked fabulous. It was so exciting the day that my house arrived. So the pre-works that needed to be done to my site was simply putting the stumps in. So it's an above ground house. And so that was very, very simple. And that means that one of the wonderful advantages of having a prefab house is there's barely any mess on your site. And so the house arrived, it was craned onto my site in 2 halves, and everything was in there. I mean, it had plastic wrapping on it, but it was descended down on the cranes, and then they put it together, and I had to buy some curtains. Everything else was there. And I also needed to just, you know, do this, put the services in. So basically have the sewage and water connected, have the electricity connected. Everything else was there. My beautiful induction stove top and the whole kitchen fit out. My reverse cycle aircon heat pump, everything. The other thing that I needed to install was the thermal mass, which is water bottles or bottles. They're wine bottles that came from my father, but the idea is that you can actually have a house that's very light and tight without a concrete slab, but by having a very well insulated house with a good well-sealed building envelope with northern light coming in, so you get all that light in the winter. If you actually install thermal mass, as I did after the build, then you're actually going to increase the energy efficiency of your house. And I haven't had it rated since the 7.7 stars that we got as part of the building certificate process. But I do think it'd be up around 8 stars NATOs now, simply because I was able to add in thermal mass in the form of water after the build. However, everything else was there. It was very simple. And then the only thing I had to do was then, you know, put the solar panels on, and Bob's your uncle. It's a wonderful way to have a house built.
One of the things that implies is that the actual site disturbance during the construction time is pretty minimal, and this might have been something that actually was a benefit to you as well, David, given that the site was small. How did that? What did that look like? Sophia, I'll go to you first, and then I'll go to David, because you've got two very different stories there. Could you just explain where your house went in? What was the context?
For my house, so I was lucky enough. So again, I was a low income person. I was a graduate town planner at that point, and so I was in a country town, which meant that the land was much cheaper in 2018. So it's a vacant block of about 500 square meters. It had a beautiful, beautiful tree on it on the western side, so it meant that in terms of putting a prefabricated house on, the constraints were the power lines. We had to make sure that we could actually load the house on past the power lines. The tree was a constraint. Initially, they were saying, oh, we're going to have to get rid of the tree. And I insisted that the tree would stay. So we just did some careful lopping and we were able to put it on the site. And there was no mess on the site. And what that also means is that there's very little wastage involved in prefabrication, and the wastage that there is able to be very tightly controlled in the factory. So it means also that when you're doing that, when your house is being built, you don't have mess on your own land that is blowing onto other people's land, that's going out into the public realm. It's a much better process for where your own place is located, but it also means that in the factory, the wastage is much less. They're able to keep a close eye on it. So again, it's a much nicer construction process. And yeah, I mean, when they did the digging for the stumps, it meant that there was a little bit of earth around the place, but overall, it's a very smooth process.
David, how did that look for you on that tiny little block of land in a very busy part of the world?
Yeah, look, I think it's only made it easier in some ways because, putting the frame up was essentially putting the main walls up, right? Because it was frame and wall at the same time for a large part of the construction. So that really helped because it costs a bit to close laneways and cause disruption to council thoroughfares, etc. So that was really helpful. But with regards to the site itself, it's highly reactive clay here in Richmond, and unfortunately the Victorian terraces, the floor levels are very close to the existing sort of ground level. We would have loved to have put a timber floor in to keep the whole building very lightweight and low embodied carbon, but to have a well insulated floor and then have a kind of air void underneath would have meant we were creating essentially a sump in the ground, like you know, and it's just problematic with the sort of drainage around here to do that. So essentially what we ended up doing was putting a kind of concrete slab in, and we also had to provide support to the concrete slab that was lower than the council drains going down the laneway. So if in the future the council repaired the drains, it wouldn't undermine the foundation. So unfortunately, it was messier on site than I would have liked it to have been.
So, Josh, I wanted to come back to you, and you know, we talked about that preconceived idea of what a prefab construction looks like, and that it's gone through some iterations over the last few decades in Australia, from sort of perhaps more functional kind of purposes, and now moving very much into this residential space. What kind of flexibility is there for a client to design and change and mix and match and mess with floor plans and all that sort of stuff in the way that you operate? How does that work in that prefab space? Do people come and say, I like that, but I want to change it, or I need to move this here and do that?
Yeah, we have, I guess, two types of clients. One that come to us with maybe just some inspirational images and things, and a sketch that they've done themselves potentially. So we're lucky enough to have a team of architects in-house at Modscape, and then we can take their thoughts and ideas and all back to what their pre-agreed sort of budget needs to be to make it work, all the way through from concept design all the way through to planning. So, and then there's a lot of huge amount of obviously consultation with the clients to make sure they're getting exactly what they want. But on the other side, yes, sometimes they have already engaged an architect, or they have gone looking at a conventional type build, a typical build, that for whatever reason hasn't worked or hasn't stacked up, and then they've come looking for, is it prefabricated, modular building a solution. So usually when that happens, there are quite a few changes, unless the architect has done modular projects before. So yeah, usually there is quite a few changes to do if it is pre-designed without modular thinking.
So what are the restraints that modular design puts on the design of a house? What are the things that you need to work within?
So
what restrictions? Yeah, what restrictions are there on you in terms of how you design it?
Generally, you can build anything at a cost, of course, but we're typically designing around what can physically get onto the site. So that's the first thing we do, is just have a look at the logistics and make sure the truck and what size module can get down the street, and as Sophia said before, if there's any overhead wires or if there's trees. So just looking at physically, can it get into the site? And then we'll work back to what is the best and most efficient size module that can get there. So generally, we're sort of delivering modules up to 18 meters length and sometimes up to 5.5 meters wide, if they're a full steel frame. And we are pushing more though into timber frame and full timber frame. So slightly smaller modules, but still up to 5.2 wide by 12 meters long, and then 4 meters high. So we're really working around those, what can get on the back of a truck, but generally very oversized truck, to get to site.
So the constraints are less in what the design is on the site and more in how you actually get it onto the site because it's pre-built.
Correct. Yes. And then just working out if there are any other add-ons or elements, or big sunshades or parapets or a nice big pitched roof. Some of that work can be designed to be completed on site. It's just all part of the planning and the design intent.
I can speak to
that's really interesting.
Yeah, there's some other constraints like that are quite outside the realm of the physical and logistical constraints, and that is planning rules, particularly when you get large residential estates. There's a lot of residential estates that will actually include in their covenant that you are not allowed to have prefabricated buildings. You're not allowed to have buildings that are relocatable. In other words, that they were constructed in a factory and they're transported onto site. And those covenants are very, very hard to push back against. Not impossible, but it is something that is quite frustrating that it's legal and planning issues that can be a barrier to using this really efficient design system for a house. There was a question in the chat about whether there might be pushback from banks. So when I was on my journey of trying to build my own house, with the first project I was trying to do, or my first idea, because of the cost issues, it was starting to get out of hand. I thought I could be an owner builder, and there was a very big pushback from the banks about that. That's actually a very difficult road to go down, and I wouldn't recommend it unless someone is very experienced in project management in the construction industry. So when I then went back to the bank and it was like, okay, I want to do this style of house, it's prefabricated. What I found was they weren't actually, they were quite happy to accommodate that, but the valuation came back much lower than I expected. And I think that might be an issue, that a house is considered to have less value on the market if it's prefabricated. And again, that speaks to the prejudice that we've got at the moment in the industry, or not the industry, in the market. So other constraints or things to consider that I saw come up in the chat were the fact that they may not have thermal mass incorporated into the construction. To be honest, that's one of the wonderful phrases I learned from people like Jenny Edwards is light and tight is actually can be a more effective way to have a thermally comfortable house than having lots of heavy thermal mass, which also has a lot of embodied carbon in it. So light and tight, you can have a house that is really well insulated and really tightly sealed, which is what prefabrication can achieve for you. And that means that as long as you get your passive solar coming in the winter, then that can be enough to warm the house up, because then it becomes nighttime. You use your thermal blinds, so they're honeycomb blinds that I installed into my house, and that'll keep the heat in, and you can achieve that without much thermal mass. I added my thermal mass in with water bottles. Water's actually got twice the bang for buck in terms of thermal retention than concrete, which is a little known fact, but it is in the government resource, Your Home, which I highly recommend. It's a resource that's online. You can find out so much information, and it's got information about prefab building in there as well. So that's some of the things to consider. They're all issues that can be addressed, but it's worth trying to find ways around those issues, and because the result you can get with prefabrication is it's just such a good way to build, as far as I'm concerned. So you can overcome those constraints.
Helen, there's a couple of good examples. Actually, some videos on our website. The car might be able to find some links to some installation videos. It sort of shows you the whole process and shows you some of the different constraints we deal with.
So I guess part of this is speaking to the fact that prefab doesn't have a great reputation in Australia. And some touched on the planning laws, potentially insurance, potentially lending. What kind of policy changes do we think need to happen in order to move this along a bit? And I was made aware that there has been some discussion of prefab as being a potential opportunity and or solution to the housing crisis, and that federal and state ministers have started looking at that. Can any of you speak to some of the obstacles the other obstacles besides the things that Sophia's just already mentioned around the bank and the planning? Are there any others that you're familiar with that we need to kind of sort out the regulatory environment for this to happen? I'll throw that open to all of you, really.
No, I can definitely say that some of the especially on the East Coast of the states are pushing into calling it MMC, so modern methods of construction. So Queensland government have just done a pilot of 100 MMC homes for key worker accommodation in the regions, and they're looking to try and do 500 to 1,000 this year, which is great, and then continue growing to meet their mass shortages up there. New South Wales is doing similar but on slightly smaller scale at the moment, and Victoria's just released 250 regional MMC homes for Homes Victoria. So yeah, the states on the East Coast that I can speak for are definitely getting behind it and trying to open it up to become more widely known and more accepted.
But in some ways, to play devil's advocate, Josh, in some ways, those kind of projects, do you think they actually project an image that this kind of construction is something that you might want to consider in a regular house construction process? I mean, or do you think they kind of reinforce that image that it's, it's mass produced, it's cheaper, it's not as good quality? And so what do you think needs to happen to actually extend that?
So that's one of the key things that they were doing, and they're doing workshops with a number of modular suppliers. And yeah, one of the key things is that you can go down the street and not realize that it's a modular home. It just looks like the rest of the suburban street. So that is a one of the big goals of all the states is achieving that, and to get away from the old conception that it's an old demountable or a site shed. So yes, it's definitely a big part.
I mean, I think that's an education issue, right? Because the quality that you get with potentially can get with prefabrication is can be a lot higher actually. So a really good prefabricated project, you wouldn't really know that it was prefabricated, right? And with regards to the sort of what you touched on earlier around flexibility with regards to design and the possibilities for prefabricated, this project here is really testament to you can have quite an ambitious architectural form and still have a large component of that house as a prefabricated panelized system. There's still conventional site work to do to pull it together afterwards, but it's there's a lot of flexibility potentially and high quality. You wouldn't know it was prefabricated. And I think the drivers are driving towards cost efficiency, sustainability, and so on a macro scale, there's going to be a lot more interest going forwards in the future about what prefabrication can deliver. I think the challenges for Australia generally, and I've been speaking with some of the bigger developers who've looked at prefabrication, is that it's a country of 25 million. If you compare it to the US or you compare it to Europe, there are a lot bigger pipelines of construction, right? So we don't have the same critical mass to enable this industry to perhaps grow as fast or as easily as other countries, because Australia is that much sort of further away from the rest of the world, and it's that smaller population. So that's the kind of challenge, I think, economically, macro scale, of prefabrication growing, but it's set to grow for sure. Absolutely, it's got great potential.
So from the point of view of policy and regulation, there's a couple of really big carrots that are coming into play, and they're based on the fact that Australia's now signed up to have 43% reduction in emissions by 2030, net zero by 2050. So the built environment in Australia contributes about 20% of Australia's emissions. It's actually a much bigger slab than people realise, and residential comprises about half of that. So let's say all of our existing houses and the houses that are yet to be built are expected to be contributing about 10%. And so there's a very strong push to reduce those emissions. And Cara might be able to put up a link to one of the Bible where I work up in the Commonwealth is the Trajectory for Low Energy Buildings. It's quite easy if you Google it. Trajectory for Low Energy Buildings. So it's looking at non-residential and it's looking at residential and all the things that we're trying to do. That strategy is right now, it's being updated. And one of the things that is pushing, as well as in the National Construction Code, we're now requiring new houses to achieve 7 stars in their design. So that is one big push, because with prefabricated houses, it is so much easier to be able to achieve that 7 stars because you've got much better control of your design. And the other big driver is going to be embodied carbon. So embodied carbon is part of what we call Scope 3 emissions. They're the harder emissions to try and reduce. Scope 1 is basically your electricity use, and your Scope 1 and 2 are the things that you control within your own premises. So how much electricity you use and where it's coming from, and the operation of your house. Scope 3 is your whole supply chain. It's also how much material is being wasted, because wasted material contributes to carbon emissions. So that's where prefabrication has that massive advantage. You're going to be able to reduce the embodied carbon that's involved with the whole construction process of your house, because all of that is controlled at the factory site, and there's going to be more incentives for the construction businesses, for all of their suppliers to be saying, hey, we've got to account for our Scope 3 emissions. That means that when you are supplying us with the materials, we can't afford wastage, because that, we have to account for it. So don't bring stuff that's going to be wasted. You've actually got to take care of that yourself, and you've got to be accountable to us so that we can be accountable to everyone else. So that is the big winner for prefab, is the reduction of embodied emissions.
Josh, can you speak to that a little bit more about what's happening at that factory end, that construction end, that is different, and where those savings can be made and where you see those savings in that process?
Yeah, there's a lot of studies around the world showing that building offsite is 30 to 40% lower carbon footprint than building conventionally. And then along with just waste reduction. So we measure our waste, and so we measured a recent large project, and we got down to as low as 9.2% waste that went to landfill, compared to 30 to 40% of a typical construction site. So huge difference there, and that is achieved through obviously working in a controlled environment where ordering material sizes cut to length, where we're designing for material sizes, which is the true sort of design for manufacture and assembly, the DFMA approach. So there's a combination of a lot of factors that go into the design to make that happen, as well as all the recycling programs and all the things we do to really bring that waste down.
While we're talking about construction processes and construction environments, are there other benefits around work health and safety, working in a controlled environment? Can you talk a little bit about some of the robotics that you've been using to do this work, and how that how that builds efficiencies? I mean, that was quite a spectacular video that you showed us the other day of how that works. Can you talk to that a little bit, and the work health and safety aspect as well?
So on the safety side, so again, just working in that controlled environment, everyone's familiar to the site. Majority of our workers have been working with us for a number of years, and there's obviously a lot of training and coordination to go into that. So yeah, the safety of working in that controlled environment in a single location, you're not having to travel to multiple sites, a day or a week. It's all in the one place. It adds a huge benefit to just that reduction of risk around the safety side of it. When 90 to 95% of the building is completed in that controlled environment, that's a huge amount of that. Generally construction's a high risk work, that it big impact to the risk profile of the project. And then on the automation, so yeah, we've just very excited to be just commissioning now our new robotics line. So that's just gone into Essendon Fields after a 3 to 4 year journey. So there's 3 robots that have just come in from Sweden that will be making our closed wall ceiling systems for majority for housing, and it's all using timber construction. So we're trying to again be greener with timber and using more renewables. So we've invested in robots that will be making timber wall frames, floor frames, ceiling frames, to be able to, overcome some of the skill shortages and increase our capacity to again help with the housing crisis.
Great. Okay. Well, I'm going to try, I have been sort of looking at the audience questions, but I'm going to try and chip away at some of the audience questions that we might not have got to, because there's nothing worse than coming to an event and not getting your question answered. So I'm going to be quite specific about these ones. Just to the first one. So the issue of the home loan, we sort of touched on it, but one of the traditional issues in Australia with prefabs was bank having issues with home loans because the houses were built on the premises of the builder rather than the property. Is this a myth? If not, has it been overcome as an issue? Sophia, you touched a little bit on your interactions with the bank and what their perceptions were about the value of the property. Did anyone else, David, did you have any experience in this as well, or was it a non-issue for you?
I remember having a conversation with the bank about it and explaining the construction process and that it was a panelized construction process. So yes, there was a period of time where there was some construction taking place in the factory, but that, really that wasn't a long period of time, and quite soon that was delivered to site and constructed. So and I think the bank may have spoken to our prefab contractor just to, I suppose for them to go through and say this is a very normal process and talk it through that on all projects, contracts that they worked on, that it was just simply kind of stages and staged payments, and the progress was fine with that regard. There wasn't an issue, I don't think. In the end, it was a no issue.
Sophia, was that your experience with regards to that where it was being constructed?
Yeah.
Did that become an issue at all?
So it does make I think any bank, it's the first reaction is going to be, whoa, that's not our normal process. I was fortunate in that, so I'm in Victoria, and so I was already banking with Bendigo Bank, and they happened to be the main bank for the construction business. By the way, their name was Bond Homes. They were in Ballarat. Unfortunately, they didn't make it through the big crunch over the last couple of years where a lot of construction businesses went out of business. It was really sad because, the director was a very genuine person who he was devastated when he had to fold the business. So there was a question about that earlier, who the business was. And yes, they did have, they had their own team on site, which is one of the advantages of prefab, is that you actually, you know who your workers are, and it's going to be that there's that consistency in your workforce. So unfortunately, Bond didn't make it through, Bond Homes, but up to that point, they did have a good relationship with Bendigo Bank. And so I was able to go to Bendigo Bank, and there was some familiarity there with their process. There is a fairly standard payment schedule that prefabricated homes use, and there was a pamphlet I remember being given that said, this is the normal thing that happens for prefabricated homes in Australia. So with that, my bank was able to be reassured, and we were able to continue that process. However, I expect that a lot of banks will initially be unwilling or uncomfortable, and it may take a little bit of work to be able to demonstrate that this is a normal process and it's becoming more and more common, and there are standard procedures that have worked many, many, many times for many bank loans.
I'm going to keep moving. Sophia, you talked about what your house looked like when it arrived. David, did your house look the same, or did you have more done on site and it arrived looking like walls and a ceiling, but not like a living room? How did that look for you? And while you've got the floor, I wonder if you could just sort of comment on the pros and cons of doing an extension or a renovation using to doing a new build and how that played out.
Yeah. So the components that were prefabricated for us were essentially, if you can imagine, a piece of stud wall that's the width of a truck, and then they're sort of flat pack stacked effectively on the truck, and then they bring them to site, and then they just load them off the truck and hoist them into place, and they clip together. So the prefabricated components were really the outer walls, the floors, and some of there was some structural elements as well which were prefabricated. So there was a box beam that carries quite a big. It's a long structural element that runs along the side of the house, which was all timber construction, prefabricated. So all of those components were essentially, if you like, traditional stick build, but they all came pre-insulated and they all came pre-wrapped with an air tightness membrane, so that when they were put into site, all that really needed to be done was that the membranes were taped together from each panel, so panel to panel. And so that was quite fast, that process in getting essentially the frame and walls up at the same time, which sped up the construction process for us. The other thing is, I noticed there's a question about cost. We did actually do some comparisons with essentially at tender stage. We were a bit nervous about the costs, so we did go out to tender to a traditional stick build company, or a couple of them, to get some comparison costs, and they actually came back more expensive than the design that we'd worked through with the prefab design and construct company. So actually they were the cheapest and most efficient for us in our situation. But that may have been because we had that advantage of going through a design process with them, and they had good certainty about the costs.
So this may be a question for you. There's a bit of a theme coming through in some of the questions around fire and fire ratings and the capacity of prefab, to meet BAL standards. I'm assuming that this is as individual as what the construction looks like, but what are the possible benefits in terms of building homes that are more fire resilient? Is that something that prefab could move into that space and have an influence over?
I'll just jump in first, and then I imagine Josh will have a lot more to add. And I believe that prefab can be made to any BAL rating that's required. A lot of, like as a planner, I had to consider BAL ratings a lot because I was working in a rural and regional area. And a lot of the things that you need to do to a house to increase the BAL rating are to do with things like the window shutters and the attention to detail with the eaves and other aspects that aren't that are kind of add-ons to any kind of building. So I'd be surprised if there's anything to restrict a prefab building being able to go up to any BAL rating that's required. So Josh can add on to that.
Yeah, that's right. Sort of our standard home is just a standard, like a BAL 12.5, and yeah, we've built a number of BAL FZ homes. So yeah, the highest you can do, which is quite onerous, but yeah, definitely achievable.
I've got a very specific question about, can somebody talk about the CSIRO prefab fireproof buildings? Is that something anyone's aware of?
Actually, no. I'd love to
No?
learn.
Haven't heard of that.
Okay. Sorry, Neva, that question might might have to take that one on notice. Okay. We've answered the one about who your contractor was, Sophia. Can any of the panel provide insights on SIPS panel home construction? SIPS, SIPS panel home construction. Does anyone know anything about that?
Again, I'll just start off, and then then that can be continued on. But yes, see, I was looking at SIPs to begin with for building my first home. So structural insulated.
Sophia, I was about to say yes. Can I ask you to unpack that a little bit, what that is for those of us who aren't so familiar? That'd be great. Thank you.
They are, that's a modular tool because it's a way of packaging your insulation and the load-bearing parts of your frame into one sandwiched unit, and it means that, again, you've got more certainty that the insulation is going to be functioning to the best capacity, and they're load-bearing panels, so you can just sort of mix and match them. Unfortunately, I was building, I'm in a country town in Victoria, and the people who I was going to get to design and supply the SIPs, they were in South Australia, and there was no builder around in Southwest Victoria who was familiar enough with this product in order to build it affordably, and so it just became out of reach. But I think SIPs are great. It just depends. You need to make sure that you've got someone who's familiar with working with them.
Thank you for that. That's very helpful. Thanks, Sophia. Josh, here's a question for you. How do you find and identify good prefab building companies? And I'm assuming this person isn't in your region, so otherwise you just say, call us.
That's right.
What should people be looking
sales
for?
Hat on. No, it's a good.
What are the things to look for?
Yeah, good question. I think just research. I think you really need to obviously be visiting the company, visiting the factory. Ideally, talking or seeing some of the homes they've built, and then just making sure that you're comfortable with them, and that they've been around for a long time, and then potentially doing some financial background checks just to make sure that they're viable, which it's something that's very, very common for us, that we're probably getting a couple of financial checks a month from whether it's the government or a big private company, as they're looking to engage with us. So yeah, good question, because there are a number of companies around, and there's lots of different companies doing different things, and they're not all the same. So yeah, it's really just doing your research on them and trying to get some advice. But probably the best place to start is that Prefab Oz website I mentioned last time. They're a good, it's a non-for-profit sort of industry association. That's a good place to start.
Okay. Can somebody speak to how certification, critical stage building inspections work with certifiers? So I assume this is a slightly different process. Josh, you might be reasonably well placed to talk about that in terms of entire buildings. And David, I might come back to you and talk about your experience with that in terms of the way that you construct.
Yes, we work with many, many different certifiers and engineers, and yes, they slightly different. The design process is a bit more front loaded because everything happens so fast in the factory. The design has to be finalized obviously before we start building, and then those consultants, when needed, they come to the factory and sign off and inspect, and then if they need to then go to site as well, they sign off and inspect. We've got a pretty rigorous sort of inspection test plans and photographic evidence, and subcontractors signing off on details that we've developed with the consultant engineers. So yeah, it is quite a process, but short answer is yes, they come to the factory, sign off in the factory, as well as then signing off on site.
And are the certifiers familiar with that process? Is the process the same process? It's just in a different place, or?
Yeah, it's becoming more and more familiar. We definitely just don't have one certifier. We have a number of certifiers depending on the region we're going to. And yes, definitely becoming more familiar.
Mm. David, how was it for you, that process? I mean, that was
Yeah, I
a
don't think it
different
was
way
any,
of constructing, but mostly on site.
yeah, look, I don't think it was any different to a conventional build for us. Yeah.
Yeah. Sophia, I've got a question about and you may not know the answer to this, in which case you can throw it to someone else. But when your building got trucked to your site, did it have a floor in place? It did, by the sounds of it, when you described it, and that's what kept the building rigid.
Yep. So
I think the question is about how does the form stay rigid in transit? I guess that's
it's a box. It's been fully constructed. Basically, it's a box that's been built. It's just got one side empty because that's where the middle of the house is. So, and of course, you know, it's loaded onto the truck bed carefully, and yeah, there's no issue. I mean, it was a house that was designed to go on stumps, so it was a raised floor. So that meant that, yeah, the entire underfloor was already very solid, and so it just got craned on. I did see a question also about the expense of the crane. Honestly, when you look at the whole cost of building the house and the savings that are made by the method of doing it in the yard, having a crane for half a day is a very affordable part of the overall cost. Mind you, that was because my site was fairly easy to access. There would be other sites that are a lot more complicated to access, and that would add to the cost, but that would be the case for whatever kind of building method was used if you're on a harder to access site.
So, Josh, are there any risks with transportation? Has it ever gone wrong? It's a lot of work to put in and then have it fall off the back of a truck, so to speak.
Yeah, to touch wood, not that I've seen with where I've been, but yes, you have heard of the odd horror story. But generally, you know, the engineering for a prefabricated home is a bit over than what you would conventionally, because they've got to take, you know, going up the Hume Highway at 100 kilometers an hour. So they are generally a bit heavier than you would normally build a home. So that's a bit more certainty you can add. And but yes, you've got to make sure that the company you're choosing has had that experience, and you see how they're packing and loading and wrapping, and obviously some potentially some transport bracing and things, just to make sure that it does get there, and it's not in not in pieces. But the transport company itself is also very important to making sure that they've got the right trucks, the right drivers, the right airbags on the truck, to make sure that you know, it's an expensive, you know, module that's coming on the back of a truck, that it is well looked after, you know, getting from the factory to the site.
Now, we've got a bit of a theme of questions coming through around cost and cost per square metre of construction once you take in all of the different factors. And the sort of assumption there that cost is actually lower for some of these kinds of houses. I could be wrong, but I'm getting the sense that does depend on the design and what you're after and how big it is and how it's constructed and all those sorts of things, in the same way that a normal build might be. But what's the general overview of like cost per square metre when we're comparing, you know, conventional build to a prefab build? That might be, I mean, I know that Sophia found it, I'm thinking Sophia found it cheaper when she looked at hers. David certainly identified that it was a cheaper method of construction for what he wanted to do. Is that what the research is telling us, Josh? Is that it is cheaper per square metre?
Probably overall, it's should be similar or the same. Yeah, and it really depends on the design. You know, some of our high-end homes are quite cost-effective compared to other conventional bespoke builders, and when you take into account that we can be finished in under 6 months, but you might only actually have to rehome for 3 months compared to rehoming for 12 to 18 months. There's a big cost in going and finding somewhere to rent for 12 months. So that's where you can get it more cost effective, but on the, against the big conventional home communities, they're still quite a low price point of conventional building. So it is getting closer, and like David mentioned before, with the more uptake and some automation that us and others have invested in, then yes, the price point should be and will be coming down to get more cost effective at that affordable sort of range.
So perhaps rather than cost per square metre being that different, radically different, it's about the time saved, the efficiency, the supply chain, the reliability of the product kind of thing, rather than necessarily saying it's actually cheaper when you're comparing apples with apples. But if you're taking 3 to 6 months to put a house on a block versus 18 months to put a house on a block, then there's a lot of savings in that, just in the process.
That's right. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, but it's, if you're buying plasterboard and taps and windows, generally it's the same sort of materials and the same sort of cost. So it's generally should be similar cost. It's just that really low end of those, like I said, those big sort of housing communities where they're rolling out thousands of homes. That's still a little bit of a difference.
Yeah.
And
okay.
I'll just
sorry,
add,
Sophia. Yep.
part of the reason why my house was so affordable was by me making deliberate design choices to have a simple and small house. It's not large. In fact, it's very small by Australian standards. It's under 100 square metres, but it's still a 3-bedroom and 1-bathroom house. But it's exactly what I needed, and I feel like it's future proof. It's going to suit me, and as my son moves in and out and then comes home again and then leaves again, and it's plenty, and it's a simple rectangle, and that is a really cost-effective way to build a house, and it's also a very good way to you get the ratio of the outside surface area compared to your internal area, and so that makes it more energy efficient. So by choosing to be smaller, tight and light, that also got the costs down.
It's a really that you raise, Sophia. If we're going to build big houses, they're going to be more expensive, not just to build, but also to run and operate. And keeping it simple and small can actually really reduce those costs. Yeah. I think you've just answered one very specific question around how many bathrooms you've got, so that's good to know. So, I have to ask, one bathroom but 2 toilets, or just one bathroom?
No, it is just 1 bathroom.
Okay, there you go.
I am considering, I managed to get my hand on another vacant block, which is very exciting. And so I am thinking about the design for another prefabricated house. And I appreciate that, modern expectations these days are to have, if you've got a 3-bed, there's 2 bathrooms as well. So I'll be considering how I can design that into a house that is still going to be just as small but comfortable, right sized, again, as fabulous Jenny Edwards from Lighthouse Architecture would say.
A little bit of a technical question before we get to wrap up point. Will brick ever come to prefab, noting that many estates have clauses that houses can only be, for example, 10% cladded? I didn't know that estates had those clauses. That's fascinating, isn't it?
Terrible, isn't it?
Something that you've come across, Josh, in this space around brick and how it's used?
There's some a lot of new products that have been on the market now for a couple of years that are improving, like a brick slip type product. So typically it's putting on a stainless steel panel on the wall that's got some sort of grooves that you get a standard brick and cut it in half and slide it in. So it's like a panelized brick wall, and it looks fantastic. But so there's some good new products coming into that that are available, and we've used them on quite a number of projects. So that gets everything that.
There you go. Okay, and I'm going to ask one more question, which is around mold. Mold in homes has been a big health issue. And it's again in conversation in the community, well, and particularly in poorly insulated houses and poorly ventilated houses in damp climates. It's been addressed somewhat in recent changes to building regulations regarding moisture and vapour transmission. Would it be fair to say that in the more controlled environment of factory prefab, mould wouldn't tend to become established like traditional building on site in wet conditions? I mean, I guess that's somebody who might have done a bit of both, David.
Yeah, I can answer that one. I mean, look, if you get construction wet on site and it stays wet while it's being constructed for, you know, a period, then you can get mold issues while a project is under construction, right? So that can be a challenge. But I think the main issue with mold is buildings in operation, is homes in operation, and the real risk of mold forming is where you have cold spots, right, in the building fabric. So where you might have a thermal bridge. So if essentially a part of the building fabric that conducts heat very well to the outside is cold on the inside. So typically window frames are places that you see that are cold and they get condensation on them. But it can also be in, you know, the corners of ceilings at high level where they're quite wind exposed and there's wind chill on the building fabric. It gets cold. So really it's trying to avoid cold spots. So good insulation, good continuous insulation, avoiding thermal bridges. And then it's really the management of moisture in the home. So you don't get such humidity inside the house that essentially the water is condensing on the building fabric because it's cold. So there's the dew point, it's called. And so the more humidity you have in the house, then the higher the dew point. And so it's easier for water to condense on the building fabric. So look, it's really about how good the thermal construction is to avoid cold spots, so cold bridges, so well insulated, continuously insulated, good window frames, and making sure you have the right ventilation to get rid of water vapor from showers, from cooking. It can be through natural ventilation, or you could use heat recovery systems in, say, passive house projects, have continuous ventilation to get rid of water vapor and remove the risk of mold or condensation first, and then potential mold.
Great, thank you, David. That's a comprehensive answer. So I'm going to throw it at all of you now. We're going to move into the wrap-up stage, and I want to throw it at all of you and just really just ask you what you think your one kind of takeaway is on, you know, prefab housing, what you love about it, what you'd say to somebody if you were stuck in the lift for 30 seconds, if you had to convince them. What's that takeaway message that you think people need to think about? I'll go to you first, Sophia.
Okay. Takeaway, 30 seconds in elevator pitch. Prefab makes sense because it's less wastage. There's more control by the building company. You get more control because you've got a good point of contact and you can see on the factory floor what's happening. It's fast, it's effective, and it reduces carbon emissions because there's less waste and there's less embodied carbon.
Great, thank you. David?
I think it achieves great sort of high quality outcomes, energy performance outcomes. It has been faster. It has been more cost effective from the experience of our project. We were more resilient to supply chain sort of ups and downs. So, you know, from that perspective, it was good. And just have an open mind about what prefabrication actually is. You know, it can be a range of things. And in our case, it was a panelized system. And we were able to integrate it into quite an ambitious architectural outcome. It doesn't have to be a pod. It can range from a pod through to a kit of parts.
Thanks, David. Josh?
Yeah, I guess just really enjoy seeing the growth that we're seeing from being in the industry, on a day-to-day basis, and just how, every day it's being more and more accepted. So just, really enjoy seeing just that continued growth, and ideally we're matching that trend or improving on that, tripling the size over the next 5 years. And it'll be very interesting to see where we are in a few years' time.
Thanks, Josh. Well, it's that brings us to the end of our session tonight, and I must say that for me, it's been this great learning curve, opening up this whole new world of how we can do housing differently. So thank you. I think I certainly, the question is probably, if you want to do prefab, go to your builder, go to your architect and ask what you can do rather than assume that you can't, is probably my takeaway from everything that you've all said. And that it brings, that it can bring design benefits, but it can also bring such great sustainability benefits as well, which is quite astounding. So I'd like to thank all of you for your time tonight. It's been a wonderful panel. Josh, Sophia and David, thank you for your time and for your expertise and your experience, and for sharing that with us tonight. It's been wonderful. Before we wrap up, I'd like to say thank you again to all of our sponsors who make these sessions possible, and in particular for Tonight Bank Australia. I'd love you to join us for our next session, which is our last session of the extension series until we do it all again next year. And that's a topic close to our hearts, and we touched on it tonight as well. Enoughness, building small and clever, and perhaps building light as well, light and tight as well. Also, don't forget to think about joining Renew or subscribing to either Renew magazine or Sanctuary magazine, which is our magazine around modern green homes. We thank you for those of you who are members and those of you who do support the organisation. It is a community-based organisation. We rely on the goodwill of people like our panellists tonight to contribute and to share their expertise and their information with all of us. So thank you for your contribution tonight, and thank you to all of you who contribute to the organisation. We really appreciate it. Great. Well, have a good night, everybody, and thanks again for watching.